Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, 2026 Virginia Energy Legislative Update. My name is Brad Nowak. I'm a partner and chair of the Energy, Environment, and Regulatory section at Williams Mullen. I also co-chair the firm's data center practice. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by my colleague, Chris McDonald. Chris is an attorney and lobbyist who serves as Director of Government Relations within the firm's Government Relations Group, and is an active member of both our energy and data center teams. Chris represents clients before Virginia's legislative and executive branches of government, including state agencies and boards, and brings extensive experience advocating on key energy legislation on behalf of energy industry groups, associations, and developers. This is our 6th year doing our annual legislative update, and as in prior years, we have a full and timely agenda to cover today. Williams Mullen's energy team includes more than 30 attorneys and other advisors who support clients across the full life cycle of energy projects, everything from development and permitting to financing, construction, operation, and sale. Before we begin today's presentation, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. At any point during the presentation, you can submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll address those questions at the end, time permitting. If you experience any technical or audio problems, please use that same Q&A button and someone will also assist you. And finally, a copy of today's PowerPoint will be emailed to you following the webinar. We have a lot to cover this morning. We'll start with a high-level overview of the current political landscape in Virginia and this year's General Assembly session. Then we'll walk through several key energy bills, including the current status of Virginia in rejoining RGGI, shared solar expansion in Dominion and Appalachian Power Territories, distributed generation or DG expansion, and the much-discussed energy storage expansion bill. We'll also touch on several land use measures affecting energy projects, including energy storage as an accessory use and siting reform efforts. In addition, we'll cover the FAST Act, which is addressing surplus interconnection, a shot clock proposal for the State Corporation Commission to review certain small renewable energy projects and transmission line applications, the Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Bank and balcony solar legislation, new REC retirement requirements for geothermal systems. There is a range of residential solar bills, including the Smart Solar Permitting Platform and contractor regulations. We'll also cover a bill allowing localities to require solar canopies in parking lot developments. And finally, we're going to cover a prevailing wage and apprenticeship bill at the state level, which is similar in structure to the federal IRA. We'll wrap up with some Q&A at the end. After our energy presentation concludes right around 11:30, we'll move next into our Virginia Data Center legislative update. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Chris to begin our energy presentation.
Well, thanks, Brad. I'm very happy to be here. Have enjoyed doing these with you over the years. I see a lot of friends and folks I've worked with in the General Assembly and state government who have tuned into this call, so really appreciate everyone taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. As Brad mentioned, we have a lot of ground to cover today. I think we're covering roughly 35 bills, and even that comes from thousands introduced this session, as well as over 200 energy bills, if not more. So a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to try to keep things brief, keep them at a high level. If you have any questions or comments or want to learn more, please don't hesitate to follow up with me after the presentation. As with any legislative update that I give, I always think it's important to first provide a bit of a broader political context. The 2026 legislative session was really marked by major changes brought on by the 2025 elections. Democrats swept all 3 statewide offices as former Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger was elected governor, former Virginia State Senator Ghazala Hashmi was elected lieutenant governor, and former Virginia House of Delegates member Jay Jones was elected attorney general. In the House of Delegates, Democrats also saw a blue wave last year, flipping 13 seats to expand their majority from 51 to 64. The Senate, which was not up for election last year, remained a 21-19 majority, thus giving Democrats their first legislative trifecta since 2021. And the change didn't stop with November's elections. In fact, since January began, there have already been 8 special elections for the General Assembly to fill vacancies created by various administrative appointments, House members being elected to the Senate, or in one case, the tragic passing of a longtime delegate. Next slide, please. This year, as is in the case in all even-numbered years, was a long session, clocking in at just 60 days. This is, of course, in contrast to our short sessions, which last just 45 days. As noted a few minutes ago, we saw an absolute flood of legislation this year, thanks in large part to so many new members joining the General Assembly and due to pent-up Democratic demands after a 4-year tenure under Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. The General Assembly adjourned their session on Saturday, March 14th, though they did so without a finalized budget, so the work is not yet done. They'll return to Richmond on April 22nd to take up any legislation that Governor Spanberger has amended or vetoed, and then they'll also return for a special session scheduled for April 23rd, the very next day, to hopefully vote on a final budget proposal. Next slide. We'll start off today with a major priority from both the administration and the House and Senate Democratic caucuses, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This initiative, more commonly known as RGGI, is a market-based cap-and-trade program aimed at reducing CO2 emissions from power plants. Participating states set limits on CO2 emissions, generation facilities must then hold allowances for their own emissions, and companies can buy and trade these allowances for their emissions. Currently, 11 states across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic are members of RGGI. Virginia joined RGGI under Governor Northam, but then Governor Youngkin removed the state from the compact. Litigation has ensued over the last several years about this removal, but now with Dems in control of the House, Senate, and Governor's Mansion, it's effectively a moot point. This year, the General Assembly found two paths to rejoin RGGI. First, they included language in what's called their caboose budget bill, directing DEQ to file regulations to return Virginia to RGGI. This bill has already been signed into law, and a 90-day window has been triggered, giving DEQ until May 21st, 2026 to file. Second, Delegate Herring and Senator Locke introduced legislation directing DEQ to establish and maintain a program consistent with the requirements and goals of RGGI. This bill is currently before the governor. Next slide, please. If you've been joining these updates for any number of years now, you've seen a lot about shared solar, and we have more updates this year. Shared solar, or as it's called pretty much everywhere else besides Virginia, community solar, refers to small to mid-sized projects of no more than 5 megawatts. Virginia's shared solar program in Dominion territory was established in 2020 and limited to just 200 megawatts. In 2024, the General Assembly passed legislation that authorized up to an additional 150 megawatts. To date, Dominion has not yet released this capacity, even though the initial capacity is fully accounted for, and there are over a dozen projects on the wait list. This year, Delegate Rip Sullivan and Senator Scott Surrevell introduced legislation that authorizes an additional 525 megawatts of capacity. This capacity shall be released upon the earlier of a determination that at least 90 megawatts of the current program has been subscribed and project construction is substantially complete, or July 1, 2026. This replaces the existing 150 megawatts that's currently in limbo. This bill also authorizes the SEC to further expand this program in the future, thus avoiding the need for stakeholders or lobbyists like myself to continue to go back to the General Assembly and lobby for additional capacity. Finally, since the first tranche of this capacity effectively ended up serving 100% low-income customers, as a way to mitigate against potential cost shifts to non-subscribers, this legislation establishes some guardrails for future low-income customer participation for the additional capacity. These bills have passed both chambers and are currently before the governor. Next slide. Virginia's shared solar program in Appalachian Power Territory was established in 2024 and limited to just 50 megawatts. The program launched last year in 2025 and already has numerous projects on the wait list. HB 809 and SB 255 propose moderate expansions of this program, providing an additional 50 megawatts in 2026 and an additional 50 megawatts in 2028. Like the previous set of bills, these bills also provide the SEC with discretion for future expansions of the program. Finally, this legislation also recredits what's called net crediting functionality, establishing a consolidated billing system for Appalachian Power customers that's currently a best practice not only in other shared solar programs across the country, but in Virginia as well. These bills have passed both chambers and currently await action from Governor Spanberger. Next slide. The next several bills that we'll address this morning are ones that we've actually seen before, at least in concept. And if you've been on the webinar last year or the year before, we've talked about them then as well. We'll start with House Bill 628 and Senate Bill 175, dealing with distributed generation expansion. These bills propose expansion of the annual percentage requirements under the Virginia Clean Economy Act, or VCEA, for behind-the-meter renewable generation. When this bill was introduced last year, the patrons noted that it was in response to continuing concerns that they heard about the need for putting solar on resources other than forest land or farmland, such as rooftops or brownfields. Despite robust bipartisan support in 2025, Governor Youngkin ended up vetoing the bill. Undeterred, Senator Van Valkenburg and Delegate Carlson returned this year with similar, albeit more ambitious legislation. Currently, the VCEA requires that 1% of all of Dominion's RPS requirements come from behind-the-meter solar, wind, or anaerobic digestion. This legislation increases that target to 4.5% for 2026 through 2030 and 5% for 2031 through 2045. Additionally, of the 16,100 megawatts that the VCEA declares in the public interest, this legislation stipulates that at least 1,000 megawatts of that shall be placed on previously disturbed sites. Finally, it tweaks Dominion's REC retirement requirements, requiring that at least 75% of all RECs come from resources located here in Virginia. The SEC is also directed to evaluate the future availability of RECs from 1 megawatt and below resources in Virginia and make tweaks to the VCEA requirements as necessary. These bills have passed both chambers and are currently on the governor's desk. Next slide, please. Another retread bill. In 2025, Delegate Sullivan and Senator Bagby patroned legislation that greatly expanded Virginia's energy storage targets under the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Despite bipartisan support, it too was vetoed by Governor Youngkin. So this year, the patrons returned with another set of ambitious bills with even larger goals. HB 895 and SB 448 require that Dominion construct, acquire, or procure 16,000 megawatts of short-duration energy storage, meaning storage resources with less than 10 hours of generation capacity, and 4,000 megawatts of long-duration energy storage, defined as resources with 10 hours or more of generation capacity by December 31st, 2045. APCO, on the other hand, will be required to construct, acquire, or procure 780 megawatts of short-duration energy storage by December 31st, 2045, and 520 megawatts of long-duration storage capacity by December 31st, 2045. Next slide, please. But that's not all. If you're a storage developer on this call, you know that safety is a major concern amongst industry, utilities, and local governments. So there are numerous provisions in this year's bills that get at that. First, this legislation calls for model ordinances to be developed and updated every 3 years, as well as establishes a work group that will aid in these processes. Next, the State Corporation Commission is required to approve an independent auditor that will participate both in the formulation of each utility's RFPs, as well as the evaluation of the proposals submitted. Next slide. Additionally, this legislation directs the SEC to host a technical conference initiated no later than September 1, 2026, to evaluate nationwide safety standards and practices related to short-duration energy storage development. Critically, this will include an examination of spacing requirements and an evaluation of NFPA 855. Finally, there is something akin to a proof of concept provision in this legislation, requiring that the SEC establish a long-duration energy storage demonstration program. These bills went through multiple iterations over the last 2 years and countless amendments, but ultimately this year both passed the House and Senate and are before the governor. Now, It's notable that while the governor has not yet signed these bills, she did include them in her Affordable Virginia platform and has even publicly celebrated their passage. So we expect favorable action in the days ahead. Next slide. Keeping on the theme of energy storage, the next set of bills to address are HB 891 and SB 443, which establish by right authority for the development of accessory storage on existing permitted solar developments. Under this legislation, any additional storage that is to be developed on the permitted solar will not require a special permit and will not be subject to any other approval process, including land use approvals or any changes to existing siting agreements. These bills actually ended up passing the General Assembly fairly early and are currently on Governor Spanberger's desk. Next slide. And speaking of local approval processes, we come to another one of the biggest bills of this session. Like many of the bills we've talked about so far this morning, this is yet another fresh effort at legislation that we've worked on for many years now. HB 711 and SB 346, known as the Siting Standards Bills, establishes standard criteria and effectively puts a ceiling on what localities may and may not consider or require when permitting solar. This includes limits on setback distances, fencing, panel heights, stormwater erosion and ground cover requirements, wildlife passage requirements, and clarified decommissioning plan requirements. Notably, this bill still maintains a local government's ultimate authority to approve or deny any project. It doesn't force their hand. Should a local government deny a project, they will simply have to report to the SEC an explanation for their denial. And given how many projects that we've seen denied and have been declared not in conformity with a local comp plan, this bill also requires that the locality provide information about any finding of nonconformity with their comp plan, as well as the information and date about the last revision to their comp plan. Already under Virginia code, localities are required to review their comp plan every 5 years. So this information should really prove critical to developers looking to work most effectively and efficiently with local governments. This bill this year passed both the House and Senate and is currently awaiting action from Governor Spanberger. Next slide, please. Facilitating Access to Surplus Transmission Act, or for less of a mouthful, the FAST Act. This legislation requires Dominion and APCO evaluate potential surplus interconnection capacity at their existing or planned solar facilities across Virginia. The idea here is to assess where additional generation may be more easily added, taking advantage of existing infrastructure and hopefully rapidly adding capacity to our grid. The bills call for each utility to use these evaluations to establish pilot programs that will then in turn encourage additional solar and storage generation development. These bills both passed the General Assembly and await action from Governor Spanberger. Next slide. I included this legislation here because it was almost directly impactful to small renewable projects, though ultimately in its final form, it mostly maintains the status quo for most participants on this call. Current law requires that the State Corporation Commission complete a proceeding for a small renewable energy project, which is defined as solar or wind project not exceeding 150 megawatts, a hydro project not exceeding 100 megawatts, biomass not exceeding 20 megawatts, or storage not exceeding 150 megawatts within 9 months. As originally introduced, HB 466 and SB 310 proposed tightening this timeline to 180 days, effectively shaving off 3 months, and adding transmission infrastructure to this timed practice. By the end of session, however, these bills had been amended to retain the 9-month shot clock. So effectively, the final form of the bill simply adds this transmission infrastructure to this code section. In this final form, the bill passed the House and Senate and is currently before the governor. Next slide, please. And another legislative retread. HB 1444 and SB 225 established the Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Bank, designed to help finance various clean energy projects across the Commonwealth. These projects include renewable energy or non-carbon emitting projects, energy storage projects, heating projects, smart grid and microgrid technologies, water conservation projects, EV infrastructure, and more. So, a pretty broad array of items that can qualify. We saw this bill last year as well, and despite broad bipartisan support, it too was vetoed by then Governor Glenn Youngkin. This year, the legislation passed both the House and Senate, unanimously in the Senate, I might add, and now awaits Governor Spanberger's action. Next slide. Balcony solar. I know the vast majority of the folks on this call are involved in the community solar or utility scale solar space, but I really wanted to include this slide because of the rather disproportionate media attention that this legislation received, as Virginia is really a forerunner in this space. House Bill 395 and Senate Bill 250 permit the use of small portable solar devices on residential structures. Quite literally, these bills ensure that a locality cannot prohibit someone from acquiring and installing a small solar array on the balcony or sides of their homes, allowing folks to use them as they would any other portable generator for their homes. These bills have passed the General Assembly and currently await action from the governor. Next slide. We arrive at yet another bill tweaking the Virginia Clean Economy Act. HB 1102 and SB 252 proposed new requirements for both Dominion and APCO to retire RECs from geothermal heating and cooling systems. Of their total REC retirement requirements, geothermal shall now account for 0.5% in 2027, 0.75% in 2028, and 1% in and after 2029. These bills passed both the House and Senate and await action from Governor Spanberger. Next slide, please. A lack of consistency and clarity continues to define the solar permitting process, and that includes utility scale developers, community solar developers, and even residential developers. House Bill 590 and Senate Bill 382 seek to change this, at least for residential systems, and establish the Smart Solar Permitting Platform. Once developed, this will allow contractors to apply for permits for residential solar construction and local governments to process applications all online in one easy-to-use system. Now, localities may opt out of this and establish their own automated systems, but if they do so, they'll be subject to strict reporting requirements to ensure they're not making their process unnecessarily complicated or more burdensome than the Smart Solar Permitting Platform would be. These bills are both before Governor Spanberger awaiting action. Next slide, please. Before we step away from residential solar, I'll briefly address two bills. House Bill 1439 and Senate Bill 823 are consumer protection bills and will result in new requirements related to solar contractors. Really, these are intended to ensure that contractors are open and honest with potential consumers and ensures that certain contract provisions will be included in any future agreements. Any willful violation of these new requirements will result in $2,500 fees that will be remitted to the low to moderate income solar loan and rebate fund. This legislation does have a delayed enactment of January 1, 2027 to ensure that the Board of Contractors has time to develop and adopt their new regulations. This industry-led effort are currently on Governor Spanberger's desk awaiting action. Next slide, please. Very briefly, because I want to get to the next slide and I know we're running short on time, I'll mention these two bills. House Bill 1234 and Senate Bill 26 authorize a local government to include requirements for solar canopies on surface parking areas for new developments. We've seen this bill or a form of this bill for many years now, as stakeholders and patrons have continued to work on it year after year and amend it to try to ensure it's actually feasible, both practically and financially, for the localities and developers. Under this legislation, a locality may require that a solar canopy be installed on up to 50% of non-residential parking areas with 100 or more spaces. This legislation does provide authority to the locality to deviate from this requirement in their ordinances if needed. This year, the bills actually passed both chambers and currently await governor's action. Next slide, please. Our final batch of bills for this morning pertains to prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. These four bills all had interesting, bizarre journeys through the General Assembly. House Bill 1372 from Delegate Dan Helmer and Senate Bill 758 from Senator Aaron Rouse were introduced and intended to mirror the requirements for tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, related to solar developments. We actually saw similar legislation last year, though it failed to go the distance and become law. This year, HB 1372 was tabled, meaning effectively killed, before the halfway point of session hit. Meanwhile, SB 758 continued to be amended and refined up until almost the last week of session, when it too met its demise in House appropriations. HB 1393 and SB 253, on the other hand, were not intended to deal with labor requirements for energy projects at all. In fact, as introduced, these bills originally simply established pilot programs for energy assistance and weatherization for low-income, elderly, and disabled individuals. Later, this legislation was amended to add new provisions that could potentially allow Dominion to recover additional costs from data centers, namely distribution costs and capacity auction costs. Later still, House Bill 1393 was amended to include general new labor provisions, requiring that for a CPCN, the SEC shall require the use of a prevailing wage to the extent it finds it's in the public interest, and registered apprentices to the greatest extent practicable. This provision would apply to any projects greater than 5 megawatts and permitted after July 1, 2026. These two bills did pass both the House and Senate on the last day of session and are currently before the governor. They are still front and center, however, in ongoing debates and negotiations regarding data centers, so it's unclear exactly what will happen to these bills or what their final version will look like should the governor sign them. Next slide. I think that brings us to the end, Brad. I'll kick it back to you as I take my breath.
Sounds good. Well, thanks, Chris. We've got several questions. I just want to reiterate what Chris mentioned before. This is sort of a snapshot of many bills before this General Assembly session. So if there's a bill that we didn't cover that you have questions about, feel free to email us. So let us get to a couple questions before we pivot to our data center presentation. So first question I see here is, if the governor signs a bill or takes no action, when does the legislation become effective?
Yeah, great question. So right now, all legislation that was sent to the governor's office must be acted on by 11:59 p.m. on April 13th. The governor can amend, veto, or sign the bills. If she amends them, the General Assembly will have to vote by a simple majority to confirm or reject the amendments. If she vetoes a bill, the General Assembly can only override that veto with a supermajority. If she does not act at all, by the end of her action window, the bills are actually deemed signed and will become law as normally prescribed.
There's a question about shared solar legislation. The question is, will the SEC need to update its existing regulations or approve new tariffs or rules to implement the law? When is that expected to be done?
Yeah, great question. Since there are a lot of moving processes with shared solar right now. So for the Dominion program, the SEC will be required to update the regulations by December 31st, 2026, so by the end of this year. And then in turn, Dominion must file any tariffs, agreements, or forms necessary for the implementation of their new version of shared solar by March 1, 2027. APCO has similar timelines. The SEC shall update their regulations for the APCO program by the end of this year, December 31st, 2026. And then the utility shall file any tariffs, agreements, or forms necessary for the updated program by March 1, 2027. I will note for the APCO program, because it does have that fix that establishes net crediting functionality, this is actually going to be a little bit more delayed than the current program and the current processes. So net crediting requirements will go into effect beginning July 1, 2027. So a year from the normal enactment date that we usually deal with.
Okay, why don't we get to one more question and then we'll pivot to our data center. Is there any update on the governor's appointment of an energy czar? And if so, what are the role and responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question and very timely. Actually, just yesterday, Governor Spanberger announced the creation of a Chief Energy Officer position. So they actually get to call themselves the CEO of the Commonwealth, and named her first energy officer, which is Josephus Almond. Josephus, I'm sure many people on this call know, has been a longtime attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. He's been a member of the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation, and actually served as a co-chair for Governor Spanberger's energy transition team. He's worked as an advocate before the General Assembly for a number of years. I've had the pleasure of working with him on everything from shared solar to energy storage expansion. So really excited to have him in this role. The role itself is a little bit broad at this point. Really, the executive order that came out yesterday effectively stated that the Chief Energy Officer will work with the Secretary of Commerce and Trade, with the Virginia Department of Energy, with PJM, with Virginia's incumbent electric utilities to focus on rising costs, increasing clean energy generation, and developing a statewide energy strategy. And they'll also be tasked with ensuring that Virginia actually meets its Virginia Clean Economy Act goals. So really excited to see how this plays out. Think it's going to be really great for the Commonwealth to have someone 100% responsible for energy, and really excited for kind of the days, weeks, and months ahead.